Lesson 12 learning goals for today are to decide if two figures are congruent or not. All right, make sure you're following along in your books with 12.1. All of these triangles are congruent. Sometimes we can take one figure to another with a translation. Shade the triangles that are images of triangle ABC under translation. These would be the correct translated figures because they're not changing the orientation of triangle ABC. Please check to make sure that you have the same triangle shaded. For each of the following pairs, you're going to determine whether these figures, the images, are congruent to their pre-images. So to start, we're going to try to translate the object. It doesn't work. Next, we're going to move to a reflection. So I make a line of reflection and flip my object over. Still doesn't line up. And lastly, we're going to have to go through a rotation. We can see that rotation, it gets it somewhat lined up, but we need to find a new center of rotation. So I choose a point on my object, point D, and I'm going to rotate 90 degrees, 180, and then we're going to translate. We're going to slide point A to point H. And once we get it on there, it fits perfectly, and that means that these shapes are congruent. Okay, for number 3, we're going to see if triangle ABC lines up with DEF. First, we're going to try to translate. Doesn't quite work. Next, we're going to try a reflection. So I make my line of reflection. I'm going to flip over to see if they line up. And you can see when we're moving our object, translating, it doesn't work. So lastly, we're going to try our rotation. I'm just going to choose right on the image right there just to check. So we're going to move it first, translate A to D, and then we're going to use that point to rotate. And right there you can see that it lines up perfectly. This figure is congruent. This is figure 2, so we're looking at figure 2 to see if it actually works. Our first figure, ABCDE, we have to translate. Doesn't work, doesn't line up. Rotation, doesn't line up. And lastly, a reflection over that line right there. And yet the figure still does not match. These are not congruent figures. Looking at the first image, you can see that A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, that figure, that polygon, is larger than our other polygon. We are going to try still our transformations. Our translation, as you can see, is larger. Obviously, the shape is never going to get smaller, so reflection is not going to work. And neither will a rotation. So we tried all of our rigid transformations. None of them line up. That means that our polygon, which are both regular, are not congruent. Next, we're going to see how polygon ABCDEF translates over to the other polygon. Always choose a point that's corresponding, like B and J, and then I simply translate and rotation, and it lines right up. That means it is indeed a transformation, and they are congruent. This next video is going to be a series of the transformations of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in your 12.3. So in the first one, I just go through and I'm going to show this figure A here and a corresponding point P over there, and I'm going to translate, and then we are going to rotate our image, and they do line up. Therefore, these two images are congruent. Okay, and then the order of the points does matter. On this next one, we have figure A, which is HIJKL, and we're going to take our corresponding point, which is K right there, and we're going to find the other corresponding point, and the other corresponding point over here is B, and we're going to translate, rotate, any type of movement that's going to work there. I just performed a translation and now a rotation. And you can see these objects are never going to line up. That means that since the rigid transformations were performed, they're not lying on top of each other. These two images are not congruent. Number 3, I'm finding a corresponding point. I'm going to use G here. I'm going to slide over to point Q, and then we are going to complete a reflection. So once we're here, here's my line of reflection, that vertical line that connects the two objects together. And then we're going to flip over. Once we flip over, you can see that these objects line up, therefore they are congruent. And congruent again means same size, same shape. The next few I'm going to go through rather quickly, but you can see that we're trying to line up here. I'm going to translate, I'm going to rotate, I'm going to do everything I possibly can, and still the object does not line up. Therefore, these are not congruent objects. This last one, I'm finding corresponding points again. Usually they're alphabetical, so since we've got H, G, H, I, J, and Q, R, S, T, we would say that H and Q, it'd actually be H and R are corresponding, but we can line them up any way we want to for this time because it doesn't give us the terms we need to have. So you can see I could do a rotation, that would line it up, a reflection, so any type of rigid transformation, which means these are indeed congruent. I would now like to challenge you to describe the transformations that are happening in 1 through 5 on your books or in your books. So in this lesson here, we were to determine when two figures are congruent. What you should realize is that two figures are congruent when there is a sequence of translations, rotations, or reflections that match one figure up perfectly with the other. Remember, the things to include when you're describing a rotation is the direction, clockwise or counterclockwise, the angle that you're rotating, and the center of your rotation. When you're doing reflections, make sure you're including the line of reflection, and when you are doing translations, you need to describe whether your object is moving up, down, left, or right, and how far. You could also determine, like if I'm moving point A to point P, make sure you describe that in your transformation description. And lastly, make sure you understand that two figures are not congruent if they have different side lengths, different angles, or different areas. So in conclusion of this lesson, you should be able to decide using rigid transformations whether or not two figures are congruent. You may go ahead and complete your lesson now. We will also be able to work on it during class and ask any questions to Mrs. Kaloran. Have a great day.